Wei. It's not exactly a new phase. We were making him work very hard yesterday. He will be working very hard this week as we enter into the last phase. I say the last phase because this is the group of seminars that are coming are the last set. Xin Wei is one of these, Carlos Regalos and Mikan Schmidt will be the other one. So I know I don't need to introduce Xin Wei to this group, and I'll just simply let him begin.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Xin Wei, for so many efforts and such beautiful work.
It's a not yet. Okay. So I didn't get the title out to people, but the topic tonight is about gesture, and actually it's not irrelevant to what the seminar will be about. I showed this. I'm showing this clip. I remember now. Can we dim only the front, or is this the lights general?
It is possible to dim the front.
Okay, doesn't matter.
Someone can go right back there. It's just the one button. I can't go there.
Anyway, so the formal topic. Also, I'm going to try to make this fairly compact. Okay, so let's say about an hour to make sure there's also some time for discussion during that hour. But formally, the topic is about gesture, but not gestures of individuals, gestures of groups of people. So ensemble gesture. And also the question, what happens when we're talking about movement, meaningful movement, or even what that means, meaningful movement, significant movement, sense-making movement, when it's done in the presence of media that responds to the movement. So whereas in the floor, in the previous case, it was the TAO Dao dance group, a theater group in an event in Beijing. The floor is just static and stable. What happens when the environment is actually mutable and changing, adapting all the time. And I'll show you as we go some images about what that might mean. And the larger question has to do with questions of writing, actually. Okay, but we'll ease into that. So the first question is basically, how does gesture create sense? Okay, it's different than saying what's the meaning of a gesture, right? I can make a sign, like A, B, C, D, or sign language. Okay, so these are signs that have meanings, but that are assigned meaning, something like that. But instead, maybe the question I'm proposing a different kind of question. The word is how, not what. Like, how do movements create sense? So every word is important. I don't say meaning, but sense. So you should be thinking of Deleuze when we say that. Okay. The larger context behind that question is this one, which is basically because we talk about gesturing, you think, well, there's a gesturer. And if you say it makes sense, it's making sense, well, it's making sense to something, to somebody, right? To us, let's say. So one question would be, we can flip it around and say, what are the subjects? Meaning, who is making sense to whom? Another question is, well, when we make gestures, we can begin to think about the fact that these are done by bodies. So gestures are happening with bodies in physical space, with physical energies, but also with intent, with imagination. So what's the stuff of gestures? So we're going to put that into question as well. And then, like I said before, the question of meaning, which will also put into play. Okay, so that's it. And how do these kinds of notions get transmuted when we're in the presence of responsive media? Okay, so this is based on all these years of work. And the proposition for this playful proposition, conceptual proposition, is going to be that the media, we're going to think of media not as dumb matter, right, brute and inert matter, but think of media that has some responsiveness, like water or tissue. Okay, so that's, even if it's computational, I think of it that way. So from Wittgenstein, Philosophical Investigations, we had this very useful takeaway, which is the meaning of a word for Wittgenstein is in its use. That's how, as some of you have done this already, if you go through Philosophical Investigations, which I highly recommend for anybody doing work on language, questions of language. After carefully blowing up different kinds of theories of language and how language works, we're left with basically, let's look at how words are deployed and used. And I propose this attitude also with respect to gestures, a question of gesture. And so 2 starting points. I'm being very quick today instead of just unveiling it bit by bit, but later on I'm going to show some nice images and videos of work. And there's an experimental aspect to this, okay? Is one of the propositions was this idea that instead of banging your heads on the wall thinking, well, what does this gesture mean, what does that gesture mean? And if we think about this distinction that maybe not all movement is a gesture. All right, this idea is that basically when we try to think of a term or a notion, let's think about terms and notions that actually have some conceptual bite, right? So let's say there's all sorts of physical activity going on, and not all the activity is happening with human bodies. Some are not. After all, if we're walking with robes, there's fluttering of the clothing too. Is that part of the movement of the body or not? Well, we would like to say yes. Okay, so there's all sorts of movement. When would a movement be considered gesture? Okay, so one proposal is that, well, let's say a movement is a gesture when it evokes a response. So this is very nice because the way I put it, it's very carefully done. I didn't say what response or who responds. Okay, I don't demand that it's responded by just one other interlocutor. So I can do this, and then maybe nobody responds because nobody knows what I'm doing, right? So what? I'm just twiddling my fingers in the air. But maybe I go like this, somebody waves back, or I go like this, and then a moment later somebody comes to the front, okay, et cetera, et cetera. Or I go like this, and the air currents are responding in a way that ordinarily they would not do. Then it's a response. It's a ghostly response. So movements can become gesture contingently. And then finally, looking at the pragmatists, or in this case, Morse Peckham or John Dewey, there's a more general notion, which is the meaning of a sign is in its response, which is very powerful, right? Because we don't say when that response happens, or what is the nature of that response, just that there is a response, or there's a recognition of some other action that's construed as a response, which then turns this mark into a meaningful mark. So it's very beautiful to think of it that way, right? I think. And all this is, we're trying to approach this kind of experimental work with this idea, and this comes from yesterday too, right? Instead of approaching it, let's say, as an ontological project, right, as we would have said yesterday, categorizing different kinds of movements according to a schema or set of categories, instead of taking a processualist approach, and in the seminar, in fact, we'll probably do a little bit more talking about what that might mean. So instead of talking about what is the meaning, we think about how is meaning being made, or maybe better, how is sense being made, sense making. Okay, what's going on here? Okay, and again, to deflate some of the, let's say, maybe some of the strong claims from AI, right? The current generations of AI, but also early 50s, good old-fashioned AI. So instead of thinking about having a Shannon theoretic model for communication, A gestures to B, meaning sends a signal to B, which has a message encoded in the channel, and then it gets decoded, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, with this idea that we can actually pack meanings into some bits and then unpack the meaning from the bit. That conceit that Shannon himself never agreed to, actually. I talked about that last year. Okay, instead of thinking about that kind of conceit about language, about languaging, maybe we can be a little bit more circumspect and modest when we think about signaling. That these different acts of languaging, we first think of them as what's being signaled. What is being achieved by the signaling activity? Okay, so these kinds of approaches. So I'll share a slide sometime, and you see references. And then with the Topological Media Lab and now Synthesis Center, it's all very playful, but conceptually playful, which means we bracket these kinds of notions, and it's not limited to these terms. Okay, we bracket what a body is, we bracket who are the agents of this communication, we bracket what computation means. Computation does not have to mean for us in our laboratory Turing equivalent computation in a digital computer. So we're thinking in terms of liquids, for example, water, air. how do these kinds of media, analog media, how can we think of their state changes in analog media and state changes in configurations of people who are moving together as dancers and musicians? How could that be thought of as a form of analog computation? But it's no longer computation the way we think of computation that we learned in computer science. Okay? It's a more ancient form. Other things we bracket, which is pass by this because we don't have time to discuss it tonight. Okay? Okay. So, now let's finally start with some visually richer signaling. Okay. So this question, how is gesturing happening? What is the gesture doing? We have many different ways to approach that, right? So one way, of course, is to think in terms of language, and there are so many ways. And yesterday we heard Chris, for example, give some very beautiful, rich examples coming from poetry and Heidegger. So there's a lot we can say around that. We could take a more formal approach to language and languaging through structural methods, which would be more like people coming from linguistics. Or we can take an attitude of movement, looking at it from the point of view of dance and performance of music. Okay, and when I say music, when I say dance or musical performance, I really think in terms of all of us, each of us, as the agent. In other words, I like to note that when Plato in his Republic divided the philosophers and put the poets outside, if you look carefully, he did not exclude music and dance. Music and dance were still included inside the polis. Why? But do you think, what's going on here? Because, well, what's going on, I think, is that whereas the people who were writing fiction were writing representations of the world, and therefore not to be trusted, right? When we're referring to dance and to music, at least in that concept, it's part of the equipment of every single human. That every citizen should be adept in expressing himself, well, in that case himself, but let's say ourselves, in all these modes of articulation, which includes movement and singing. Okay, so it's not about music and dance as something to be looked at from an audience perspective. Another note is, since it's a small group, you can sort of raise your hands and tell me to mark something to come back to if you want a question. Okay. Okay. Another thing to think about when talking about gesture, but this applies maybe more to writing as well, is, remember I was saying earlier, if we make a movement, or if there's movement in the room, you can think of that as the sign, the mark, right? The actual movement itself. What do you mean actual? The physical material that's moving around, that's changing state or changing location, mostly changing location. But if we analogize that to a mark that's made, usually we think of the mark as something, let's say you write with ink on a passive substrate, right? Like ink on paper. But I love the figure of the watermark, because you think about this, a watermark is not one substance on top of another substance, one active substance on an inert substrate, right? Which makes the positive sign, but instead it's just a diminution of water. Of paper. So watermark is just a variation of intensity of matter. So let's take the same attitude back to movement of bodies or movement of physical stuff in the world. If we think about what is a gesture made of, then maybe we don't have to be so categorical in distinguishing between the stuff that the gesturing is done with and the stuff of the world. Or to use, I guess, Merleau-Ponty, or like the flesh of the world. So let's not arbitrarily say this is the mover and this is the world. You see what I'm saying? Okay, let's just suspend a little bit those distinctions and see what we can do. When we come back to look at dancers moving across the floor, think about the sound, right? That's pulsing through the air. These are co-resonating materials. The air, the tissues of the dancers, the physical instruments. Everything's co-resonating. Okay? That's why it works so well. Another source of another bunch of ingredients to come into play, to bring into play here, could be just looking at a larger scale, the social scale, right? What classically we think of the social scale. And I'll just show two examples of other kinds of meaning making through movement or gesture. Oh, it's a terrible representation. Oh, wow. It doesn't look like that here. It looks like that here. I can pass it around. That's my fault because this was in, I think it's in Ivrea, so it's not too far from here. So, yes, it is. It's in Ivrea, not too far from Torino. It's a festival. Is Stefano here? Yeah. So anyway, it's a festival where once a year, apparently, the people in the town divide themselves into two groups. I guess the oranges and the blues, the yellows and the blues. And the yellows go in this big cart that goes through the city, and then the blues take these oranges and they throw them lob them like stone, right? Like crazy. And the streets run with the blood of oranges. So this is one festival. Another festival is a festival called Holi, Holi. This festival, which probably people know more about, the Festival of Colors in India, where people throw these, they basically color the world. They color the world. And thinking of this as a mode of intensification. So aside from all the rich symbolic historical content to this, I want to draw attention to this as not so much making marks in the world, but as modes of, you might say, changing manners and making certain kinds of intensifications in the world. Okay. Now this is from Montreal. The sound is important. I'll just run it. Manon de Paul is a wonderful performance artist in Montreal. And basically, I show this just to indicate, we could try to analyze it as in terms of message passing, but that's not very useful, I don't think. So point made. Okay, there's so much work that we can point to from performance art or this kind of more abstracted form to think about, to question, what does it mean when we have gesturing, which makes sense. It makes sense, all right? In fact, it's even done collectively. And there are even, you can see that there are even rules of discourse, right? Of course, they're constructed very specifically for this kind of performance that are in play, and yet it's not so useful to think of it in terms of communication, right? In the Shannon theoretic sense.
From a graph, and maybe I can,
Here's another example. The next three examples I'm going to show have to do with action versus leaving a trace. Okay. I'll take her voice out. So I can't remember. Miriam Mirzakhani was was the first woman to win a Fields Medal in mathematics, and she did beautiful work in, for example, hyperbolic geometry, low-dimensional topology, and she was at Stanford. And the way that she makes marks is actually both unique to her, but also characteristic of the field. If you look at the right-hand side, you can see she used to work on these large sheets of paper. That was her style. Large sheets of paper on the floor. If you come in close to look at it in detail, you see this very charming mixture of algebra, of diagram, of drawings, of figures, custom-made drawings to understand dynamics, for example, and then some comments. If you see a different flower, done if you're lucky. Why? Estimating some Peterson volumes, etc. So she's having conversations with herself. So this very heterogeneous, of course, multimodal conversation. And what's really beautiful is to see the invention on the fly of notation. It's invented on the fly. Okay. In fact, this is characteristic of mathematics in general, creative mathematics. A large part of the effort needed, oftentimes, is when you have a fresh idea, a fresh concept, is even just to understand how to write it down, because there's no ready-made notation for these concepts. You can put together existing structures, but you make something up as you go. Okay, this is really very intrinsic to mathematics. Okay, now the other part is you look at the video, as it's been building up over time behind my back. You can imagine what would happen if we were just to freeze, come back, take a picture, and show people the resultant image. And I would wager, even if you're an expert in the room, it would be much harder to understand what's the thought, what's the movement of thought, if you just see a snapshot, versus watching her draw it out as she goes. Okay? So the temporality of the mark making is intrinsic to the meaning, okay, or to the sense making, okay, of the mathematics. So these are very, very profound points. That it's even in mathematics, which we think of as so rigorous and so precise, built on logic, there's the temporality built into the making of mathematical marks. Okay. So, but we can still say, let's be structuralists. We can say, look at the space of all possible gestures. What's the structure of that space of gestures? And this is typical for machine learning. In machine learning, in pattern recognition, this is the procedure, right, in general. And we have billions of dollars implemented into mechanizing these different kinds of algorithms for categorizing the space of all X, where X is a certain set of signs, class of signs. And there's some fundamental methodological obstacles to making that program work, that kind of thing work. One of the basic ones is non-locality. That is, I'm going to take an example from geography, from maps. If we have a map and you cut up the map into squares, and then you say, now I have a way to categorize all features in this country, right? Typically, you just basically have a city. So which square does the city fit into, or which number of squares? But if you have an extended thing, like the Andes Mountains or the Mississippi River or what have you, that go across the entire country, then that kind of approach is, first of all, it doesn't fit. Syntactically, it doesn't work. So there are all these ways to get around that, but they're all clumsy. Okay, the neatest way to do that is just to name the river. It's called the Mississippi. Look it up. Right? That's why you have gazetteers. So I call it the river parsing problem. But this, what I just said, is a problem no matter what schema we choose. There's always this problem, that there are always patterns that exceed any pre-given structure, actually. Okay. Another kind of problem is if we try to take a neuroscientific point of view to think about gesture, we can think about, it suffers from what I call the brainism conceit. That is the only kind of electrophysiology we need to pay attention to. The kind of electrophysiological data that we need to pay attention to understand languaging is the data coming from this bunch of gray matter between the temples. Okay. But you saw, I was showing dancers. And I'll be showing more videos of people doing work with their bodies. There's so much electrical, physiological processes going on, not just in one body, but across all bodies. So when in fact, the methodology is to get data, maybe 128 channels of data, from the gray matter in one body at a time. In fact, for one point at a time, a bunch of points. Okay? So there are fundamental methodological issues going on here. It's not hopeless. I'm just saying it's hypertelic. And this is what we're working on with some colleagues in neuroscience back in the United States, to get around that. Okay? More fundamentally than that is the question of nuance. So when we have discrete representation of gesture, there's a quantum, right? It's the smallest unit that you can actually discern. This is just intrinsic to digitization, right? But we know from all sorts of phenomena, whether it's economics or language or evolutionary biology or complex systems in general, that arbitrarily small perturbations can have unbounded effect, unbounded consequence. Okay. And this is a profound question. It's not just because we have a sufficiently complex system. It's not just because of the complexity. It's intrinsic to any meaning-making activity with the richness of languaging, for example, of culturing, of historying. Okay. That is, arbitrarily small variation, okay, there's no lower limit to that, okay? Arbitrarily small, or what is currently indiscernible variation or nuance can have unbounded consequence, okay? So there's some severe challenges if we try to take a typical kind of, digital approach to this kind of thing. Any questions so far? I'll take a little pause. Okay, keep going. Okay, now for fun, I'm going to show a few more pieces of work. This is going to become more empirical now. Okay, so this is a performance done by a group of students from the Copenhagen Institute for Interaction Design a few years ago, and this is the main. What you're looking at is a tabletop. It's a surface of a table. I invite you to imagine how this was done. Yeah, and then? And where is she? Where is she?
Beneath the table.
Yes. There are two performers actually. So Angelisa was, I misspelled her name, oops. She was dipping objects in ink and threw them on the table, and then the other performer was below with a magnet. And we were just talking about basically agency in writing, automatic writing, automation, et cetera, et cetera. And on top of it, we were projecting, you don't see in this segment here, some real-time computational video from above. So instead of just light, it was illuminated by video. I don't think I showed it here, where at some point you see that the black, not all the black is made by ink. Some of the black was projected. And there was a camera looking at the table as well that started to, I should have shown that, which starts to deform the black imagery. So there's actually computational elements as well. Okay, I'll pass by. Okay, I'll pass by to this one. Now, my point in showing that one is basically, my point in showing this picture here, right, is there was no a priori alphabet. There's no a priori set of objects, drawings, I should say. Sure, there are objects, there are springs, but no a priori set of traces that you cut and paste or you select from. Okay, there was not a combinatorial structure here. There was no pre-designed semantics to this thing. It wasn't trying to represent anything, et cetera, all right? So there are many things you can say. And there were no rules there were no, there were no Boolean type procedural rules for engaging in the activity, okay? The way you do it if you try to code it up in C++ or something, all right? And there was no table lookup either. You can cheat. No, there was no table lookup, okay? In terms of this, the Searle Chinese box idea, right? So none of those were used for making something which was actually very engaging, and people were just engrossed with activity and the thing going on. It was a performance, all right? So, and the basic point there that I wanted to make, not just with that example, but with all these other examples, is that in most of these rich situations of meaning making through gesture, we can't sit down in advance and write down in advance the set of all possible states of the system. So Stu Kaufman, who is a evolutionary biologist, he was one of the, he was in Santa Fe, and he was famous for inventing techniques from complexity science for looking at evolutionary biology. Has anybody looked at some of his work? Stu Kaufman? Okay, anyway, a very interesting person. he has a nice little koan. He asks, imagine a hammer. Now, tell me all the possible uses of the hammer. All of them. And then, well, let's try. Okay, let's try this exercise. Okay, so what are some uses of a hammer? Okay, what else? Kill your neighbor.
Nails.
Hammering nails. Call a meeting to order. What else?
Removing nails.
We said that already.
Oh.
Fine, it's okay.
It's a weight.
As a weight. Hammer toss. Okay, da da da. Or as a word in the song, if I had a hammer. Right? Who said it had to be a physical hammer? Nobody, etc. And then he asked, do you feel your mind going blank? I asked for all the uses. All. And then he goes on and talks about this in a very nice way. He says, for example, the set is not a set, actually. There's no rule by which you say, yes, it's in the set of all uses for the hammer, or no, it's not. Knowing one use will not tell you another use. Knowing one use will not tell you what the next use is going to be. It's not an ordered set, okay? And it's not even infinite set, because you can't actually number the uses, okay? It's not even countable or uncountable. There's no isomorphism between that and any set, okay? It's what people call indeterminate. It's an indeterminate. It's not infinite, but indeterminate. Because you can keep talking about it. And over the years, people come up with more and more and more uses. So this is why we think, some of us think, is characterizes all living situations, right? Whether it's poetry or language or economics or evolution or biology, okay? And this open-endedness of rich systems is a severe challenge. So it's in that spirit that we're thinking about languaging and gesturing, okay? I'll skip this part. Okay. Now remember I was talking about substrate. See, this is even if we know what the mark is. We say this is the gesture and that's not the gesture. Michael Montanaro, who is a colleague and friend of mine back in Montreal, he's a choreographer and he's chaired dance, contemporary dance. He would teach courses to young choreographers and say to them, you know, if you take this bottle of water and throw it across the floor, you ask the dancer to do that. Throw a bottle across the floor, water bottle across the floor. I ask you, what is the gesture? Okay, what is the gesture? So is it this movement with the arm? Is that the gesture? Or do I include the bottle in that thing? So in that gesture, so I look at the bottle rolling across the floor? Or is it where it's being thrown to? Or direction, the manner in which it's thrown? Or is it what the audience is thinking as the audience watches this thing happening? You know, it's endless, right? So, so it's in that spirit we think about, well, what's the form of a gesture? If we try to ask what is the form of a gesture, that becomes quite subtle, right? It's like the watermark question. I mean, the watermark question for writing, okay? So Simondon has a very beautiful way of thinking about forms. He says here, the forms interact not with forms, but with their background, the reservoir of the tendencies of all forms, even before they had a separate existence or constituted an explicit system. Okay. So I promised tonight it would be mostly light and looking at examples, but there's a lot of discussion underneath, which I'm happy to go through with people during this week. Okay. There's a philosophical aspect to this investigation, which I'm happy to discuss with people. Okay. All right. Now let's get to something with more elaborate responsive media. So in this case, some of you may have seen this. Anybody see this before? No? Okay. So we filled this room, this is a theatrical black box in Montreal, in the I was at the Topological Media Lab. We filled the floor with Michael Montanaro. We filled the floor with 13 tons of sand. So as you walk across the sand, we wanted to estrange the body from its habitual ways of moving across the floor. Because we wanted to put in play make a much more corporeally playful situation so people could experiment a little bit more in the meaning-making, or rather in the sense-making gestures. And we wanted to see how people could invent gestures that are meaningful to themselves and to one another, okay? So putting the sand was one part. Then we had a camera from above looking from 24 feet up high, projection on the floor with about 1 billion particles made of light. Look what happens. okay? So as we toss, just, of course, what else would you do? You have sand, so you pick up the sand and throw it, right? So people just started throwing sand. And what's beautiful about this, so I'll play it again, okay? The sound synthesis, there's nothing recorded, basically, okay? It's all being synthesized on the fly. And there are dozens, hundreds of sound processes being computed in parallel, all in parallel, okay? Now, there's also theatrical lights shining on the floor, tracking where bodies are. But the system doesn't know that there are bodies. Actually, the system doesn't care. What the system does, it looks for flow, what's called optical flow. Through the camera, any dot that tends to move or change color, change in any way that's optical, will register as a little vector of change. And the system takes these thousands or hundreds of thousands of bits of change and interpret that and use that to feed it into a physics system that does a virtual magic physics. The magic physics, in turn, is mapped into a particle system, which then is interpreted, which is all in software, which is then interpreted as light, physical light, projected onto the floor. Okay? I'm describing it in this detail because all of this is formulated as a kind of magic physics. None of it is in this kind of Boolean if-then, if-then, if-then. None of it is framed in terms of classical human legible categories such as person one, person two, arm, leg, the kind of thing you do with a Connect. Okay? None of it. Okay? It's a much more primordial way of thinking about materials, matter, whether it's tissue or sand or sound, okay, etc. Also pressure. We look at the pressure, the changing pressure under the sand. We have some sensors under the sand. Because we wanted to make the entire media itself, whether it's sand or air or spatialized audio or structured light on the floor coming from theatrical or video, all as responsive media. So this is what we call a responsive environment. So it's taken 20 years, but now we have frameworks for richly giving an environment, making an environment as sensitive to gesture and nuance as a piece of paper would register ink, you know, like a Japanese rice paper would register brush. So that's what we call this calligraphic media, on. Plus, it's all done at a very fine scale. So from the point of view of the human in the room, it's material. It's not objects, like a puppet or a box or a chair. It's stuff. Okay, it has that fineness and density. Okay, like water, mist, well, in this case, video like mist, sound like water. They can scope by gesture. Okay, and it's responsive at the speed of physics. Okay, as soon as I do anything, I feel a palpable response. Okay. Now, another application. I'll just let you watch it. Okay, I'll run it twice. In this case, this was not quite as blended as the previous one. We wanted to play with the notion of calligraphy, calligraphic media. So what would it take? There were dancers. This wall projection was also on the floor, so you could see what was going on a little bit. We had a painter who was sitting watching this scene, and he was painting onto a projection of the same scene onto a pane of glass. So he's painting with inks live over the image, the video image of the dancers, and then that image was then reprojected onto the wall. So we were thinking about calligraphy where the dancers' bodies, the actual brush of the painter, and the jitter, the real-time video processing, were all part of the mark making. So we blended agencies this way. Now I'm going to, and this is all improvised, okay? It was not rehearsed. So let's see what they do. And we discussed this idea of calligraphy with everybody. So everybody was trying to make a new kind of calligraphy together, including the sound. Pay attention to the main part. At some point, you can see a wipe, and the strokes are made from fresh. It's my favorite part. And it completes the stroke. Okay. There's too much to say about this, but okay, I'll try to say a little bit. The dancers are also following, I'll give you an idea. Remember I say these do not use Boolean if-then logic rules, they do not use table lookup, but there are procedures, or rather conditionings of movement, which are typical in dance. In this case, we asked the dancers to do follow the leader type exercises where there were maybe 3 or more dancers, and the idea is that one would be the lead at any moment. Who was the lead? The lead would be the one whose body had a body part that was higher than any body part of any other dancer. And that person would become the lead. What do the other dancers do? They would do stylistic transformations of what they noticed from the other dancer. So for example, if the lead dancer were doing staccato-like movement, then the other dancers, if the game was to be different, they would do legato movements. If the dancers started changing, morphed into doing more legato movement, then the other dancers would begin to make their movement more and more accented, okay? So we would say just this. We say it in words or write it down. Actually, it's very carefully done with sketches, with written descriptions, things like that. But all these descriptions were underdetermined. They were underdetermined the event, right? The events are always radically richer than any description ahead of time, any conditioning ahead of time. So it's not just, in dance or theater, we know we just work with this, right? But it's in linguistics that we have this conceit sometimes, or that we have a complete model of what the event's going to be, right? So this is why I show this. Anyway, okay, yes, I do have time. Any questions, any comments so far before we go on? Okay. Improvisation. If we have such a rich environment, when we have such rich responsive environments, and remember I was saying, we want to now think about, we give people the opportunity to invent movement that's meaningful. Let's see in more detail some examples of this kind of improvisation. So what I'm going to show you, I'm going to start again. In this case, there are cameras looking at the scene, and we have real-time responsive media running all the time in parallel. There's a lot of engineering underneath, actually, to make this happen. All right, a lot of computer vision techniques, pattern recognition techniques, signal processing techniques, etc. There's a lot of math underneath this. But in this case, the dancers, the ostensive exercise was to use street dance techniques and then develop their own vocabularies. Each body would have its own vocabulary that were meaningful. In a sense, it's like saying, now I can make sounds as I move because I have bells on my clothing or whatever. Or I can nuance my voice differently now if you're a singer or an actor, right? It's like giving the body a new voice, revoicing the body. So you would want to know as a performer or just as a speaker how to nuance your voice. In this case, all the sound was being constructed on the fly by our systems, right? But she, in this case, Vero is the name. Vero was trying to understand how her body's movement is producing the extra nuancing of her body's sound. And you can see, look for the moment when she realizes that she's actually now, it clicks, when everything clicks, when she actually is wearing the sound, you'll see. Oh, sorry, let me pause this one. Okay, here we go. It's very fine, even expressions make. Dancers are incredible because she hit the mark without looking. I just went back, bang, there she was. Dancers have incredible. Are there dancers in this room? People who are trained in movement arts?
Just movement, like community arts.
Yeah, okay, of course. Actually, there's a whole bunch of people. So the thing is, yes, right, on the wall, okay. So you see, if you work with dancers, when you work with dancers, you realize there's such incredible precision Okay, this is thought in movement, all right? Not just movement and thought, it's thought in movement. There's incredible precision and expressiveness, of course, and multivalence, right, of meaning, et cetera, et cetera. Here we were equipping the dancers with extra voicing, extra media, right, extra dimensions of sonification, you might say, all right. And you could see also the delay here between the sound and the video is greater than it really was because of my really awful compression. Okay, it was actually much tighter. So when we notice she dipped her foot, okay, she goes once and then she does it again and she realizes this is not accidental, she smiles. So I always look for this. When you see somebody smile like that, that epiphany marks they get it. Now they absorbed the capacity into their body, okay? It's amazing, and this has happened many times over the last 18 years, 19 years, okay? She's still trying it out. Does this work? Does this work? Yeah, okay. It's working, she smiled, right there. So she's now wearing it, okay? So, and then you begin to explore, okay? Okay. So improvisation, as we know from theater, is not random at all, okay? It's always improvisation over structure, or rather even better, it's always improvisation over structured potential. The system has the potential to respond in predictable ways, in regular reproducible ways, with any degree of precision we can manage with our engineering, right? Just as what I just did, just as what I accentuate my voice, and because I'm healthy enough, I can rely on that, right? So it's that kind of precision that we are designing into our responsive media systems, okay? Now, it also allows unprestatable play. So in this case, you'll see in a minute, this graduate student, Katia, she brought her child in, and the responsive environment was looking at the activity with no gadgets on the bodies at all. Okay, just brought in the baby, took the baby out, started playing, and I took the baby's plush toy, and you'll see I start to, maybe it's cut out here, but anyway, I knew that whatever we did would produce sound, and I wanted to see if I could make the puppet talk, even though the sound's coming from speakers. And then you're going to hear in a few seconds, the sound artist started to infuse different symbolic textures into the responsive media. And then you'll see what happens when we notice it. We start to then invent on the spot a mechanism. Okay, you'll see what it is. I did pause this. Stop. Sorry. I want to pause this and play this. I can't. I want to jump over Vero and go to the baby. Sorry? Yeah. Oh, just pay attention to the right-hand side. Because we were playing with the baby, Navi just started infusing it with toy sounds. He just happens to have a large bank of textures. And then I thought, oh, okay, this is great. So let's make a music box. And I knew that there's a camera from above, so I said, well, if I walk around and around, maybe I can act like a rotor. I didn't know if it would work like that. There was no code written for this. But I started to walk around, hear what happens. You should hear what happens. There. See, as I slow down, the music will slow down. It worked, right? Okay, so everything was improvised on the fly, right? So, okay, let me pause this. You know what? Something's broken with my point is that there was nothing in the code ahead of time, saying, oh, music box, walk in the circle, look for baby to be the pivot, nothing. There's no model ahead of time for this. So all the meaning was invented on the fly, right? The scenario was invented on the fly. There was nothing drawn on the floor. There was no bunch of pre-recorded songs to play, if baby, play baby music, nothing like that, okay? So on the fly, we're inventing a mechanism. It was a playful mechanism. Oh, music box. Okay, it sounds like toy music. Okay, let's be a music box. If it's a music box, well, maybe it should be part. Let me be the part. And but I knew enough to say, well, if I walk in a larger radius, that's math. Larger radius means more, whatever, angular speed. So maybe I didn't even think that. Okay, retrospectively, yes. So I just did it. And then if I slow down, the music slows down. Speed up, the music speeds up. It works. So this is what we've been trying to do for 15 years, to make rich, responsive environments where people can actually improvise as freely as we improvise in theater or in dance, but with all the power of computational media systems. Okay. Let's jump this. Okay. Now, there's a lot more to learn from. So, for example, contact improvisation. Here, let's look at how people learn and, quote, improvise over structure in the highly developed area of contact improvisation. And these are individuals learning how to relate, move relationally with the assistance of other dancers around them. It's a sequence of successively more complex relationships between self and world. Again, I shouldn't assume that people know. So in contact improvisation, there's always contact between bodies. One transmits, well, transmits is the wrong word, but when people construct jointly, let's say, jointly construct intention, and there's this very subtle shifting of increasing or decreasing pressure through those contact points, and shiftings of support or withdrawal of support or providing support as everybody's moving at the same time. Okay, it's a very subtle form of movement or thinking through movement. And it's very interesting because it's relational. This is quintessentially relational. Steve Paxton was in America was one of the first big exponents of contact improvisation back in the 70s. So it's become really a worldwide standard toolkit in every dancer and every movement artist, okay? But I want to point out that what's really beautiful to look at, to learn from this, is the relationality and, again, the ability to invent on the fly meaningful sense-making through movement. And all these I think of as examples of movement movement thinking, that the movement constitutes thinking. It's not thinking about movement. It's not philosophy of dance. It is thought, okay? It's movement as thinking, all right? It's also not the same thing as you might say from, let's say, looking at Deleuze or Aaron Manning as friends, right? Thinking of thought in movement. That's also very interesting. But here, it's movement as thought, okay? So this already is being done. It's being done in these very, very highly developed and relatively compact communities. You might say discourse communities, right? It's all within dance. It's certain kinds of dance, right? Or within certain kinds of music making. But it doesn't have the generality of Japanese or Chinese or English or algebra. So the work that we've been doing for 18 years is to say, well, maybe this is what we can use computers for. Can we make responsive media that have some of the qualities of concision, abstraction, of power metaphor, multivalence, okay, and open-endedness to new meanings as writing and speech, but done through these other modalities, time-based arts. Okay, so if you come back tomorrow, we can start talking about that. So this, if I were to do a course on gesture, I would go back and slow it down because there's so much happening that we would need to look at it carefully at, let's say 20% speed to carefully analyze what's happening there. And for that, of course, we should invite some people maybe from across the wall or somebody from the movement arts to come and talk to us about contact improvisation, okay? So, but we can also put it back together again in the form of performance, but I won't show this tonight because we're supposed to be talking about gesture as a mode of thinking, but yes, and remember I was talking about as we ourselves are expressing, articulating, okay? But of course, this is the way it's used. Okay, I just read it as I talk. Why not talk? The way it's used in dance would be to make a performance, right? To actually, come on. Hello, yeah, okay. And you can see in this work, it's called Free Fall, right? There's a lot of contact improvisation thinking, ideas, motifs, which are deployed in performance. And it's done on a stage, it's rehearsed, right? It's done to marks, it's perfected, and then it's done for you. You're looking at them do this work, okay? And you are mute as bodies. So it's not at all the same mode in which I'm thinking about gesturing as a mode of thinking, as a mode of articulation, as conversation, okay? So this is how it's typically used in this community, in this context, is another body of techniques, right? All to enhance the creation of works for you, the audience, to look at. Okay, spectator relationship. That's beautiful. That's not what the proposal is doing. The proposal is thinking about a new kind of science. That is knowledge production. In Canada, it's called recherche création, research creation, is production of knowledge using techniques from the art that essentially depend on having access to techniques from the arts. Okay, appropriate to the inquiry, right? That could not, where the insights could not have been found without using those kinds of techniques, okay? It's not the same thing as using, let's say, techniques from engineering or biology or what have you to make a work of art. That's not the purpose. They're not the same thing, okay? So the techniques we've been using have to do with kind of propositional play using poetic logics, and I still have a little bit, okay? I'll be finishing soon, okay? Some of the qualities of this kind of play is that we're thinking about having people in the same room at the same time. So it's thinking of ways to using responsive environments and focusing on attention, for example, to enrich a given occasion. So it's not telematic situations, first off, okay? Typically it's not. And also something that affords this kind of magic logic. That is, we can move fluidly between physical activity, physical objects, through feature extraction into a computational setup where we can interpret the features as we wish. Interpret the features like the way the light's being intersected by my hands here, okay, like this, okay, as puppetry, for example. And then using that to computer vision, then to go to some algorithms and maybe produce music as they go like this, right? So I have a whole bunch of software which I can show in a different course, not this one, okay? Where we give people these kinds of instruments that can transmodally convert from gesture in one modality to gestures in another modality into media, okay? So that we have a whole set of these kinds of what we call instruments, okay? And also these are collective. These responsive environments are built at a scale where we can have a bunch of people at the same place. It's not one person on the screen, or one person with a mouse, or one person with HMDs, or one person with a goggle. Okay, these are what we call solipsistic technologies. Okay, all right, and so that's why I use the word also. The collective, the ensemble, and also very importantly inactive. So those of you who have done some readings in the so-called 4E, 5E, 6E literature, right, enactive, E-N-A-C-T-I-V-E, means that these events, right, that whatever the events are, we don't come to the event with an a priori distinction between subjects and objects or between subjects and world, okay? We try to avoid requiring that the participants in the event come to the event with that pre-given set of categories, okay? So, but of course, those relations can be constructed in the course of the event. So that's how we try to approach research, okay? Other kinds of simpler assumptions for the conditions for our research in terms of inquiries like gesture is erasing the divide between spectator and performer. This came from working with people in theater from some time ago. It's about 100 years of this kind of work, right, in theater, but we're trying to deploy that in all sorts of research, okay? That means, for example, that if we're doing like bioengineering research, our engineers actually take some somatic exercises and they put themselves in the chair. You know, we are our own guinea pigs sometimes too. Okay, there's an ethical question there. Another aspect is the bracketing of language and narrative. So 20 years ago, when I first started doing this kind of work with people from theater, we were looking at at avant-garde theater from early in the 20th century, say, okay, like Artaud, let's say, they say, okay, let's suspend for a few years access to narrative. Okay, but that was back in 2000. Because we wanted to look at, if we want to look at the emergence of signification across all modalities, we wanted to avoid what Antonin Artaud called the tyranny of literature. Okay, he had very specific hobby horses. It was French theater, early 20th century. Okay, very particular. Okay, but still, we wanted to be careful because we knew the power of language. We knew very much the power of spoken and written language. So we wanted to have access to these very delicate, like bamboo shoots. Well, bamboo is very aggressive. Mushrooms, okay. These very delicate tendrils of new modes of articulation and signification, and paying attention to the gestural, paying attention to the fineness of perturbation, right? All that kind of qualities. But now, after 15 years or so, we're beginning to bring it together again. So beginning to work with people coming from theater and literature and architecture, for example. Okay. But the most important point is the last one here, about how now we have a set of techniques for enacting a situation, okay, in the 5E sense. Okay. And finally, coming back to art. So it is, what I say to the people working with us in the experimental setup, coming from the arts or the sciences, is that yes, we use all these techniques from, whether it's computer science or from physics or from dance, but the purpose is not to make, I say to the people, the purpose of the Synthesis Center is not to make art. It's not to make art, okay? We have artists working in the center, but the purpose is not to make art. It's not a production facility. However, once in a while, it is the most appropriate mode of producing work in public. So this is an example where we did installation in the Musée des Arts et Métiers in Paris, Museum of Arts and Crafts. Anybody been there? This is maybe Chris says, it's an 800-year-old church. It's adjoining the more modern building. And there's a Foucault pendulum behind the camera. We have cameras surrounding that. And looking at the rotunda area, so that any activity in that rotunda area, we would dissect it temporally. We'd take the activity through the cameras, and we'd take out, for example, the high frequency parts, like this kind of frequency parts, separate that part of the video from the rest of the part that's not moving high frequency. Like maybe I'm just walking slowly, but I'm going like this with my fingers. All right. So this part would be made visible. The rest of it would be blacked out, right? Or parts of the activity that were beyond, let's say, a certain amount of time in the past. So it would take past activity. So different kinds of temporal filters were applied to the streams of video, live video, okay? And then Oana Suteo-Quintilian, who's a filmmaker, working with Julian Stein, who's a media artist, would then palimpsest together these different moments of time and frequency, let's say, palimpsest together into a 9-panel painting of sorts, time painting, which was then inset into the walls of the church and toned with the color of the light through the stained glass window. So when you were looking at the stone, it looked like it was made of chalk. The figures looked like it were drawn not with video, but drawn with chalk. Okay. So a lot of care was taken to make this fit into the architecture of the church. What happened? Thousands of people came by, and they started to play in the space because the space was conditioned so that their activities were you might say, enchanted in a certain way. And one of them, this woman here who's at the end, anyway, so they just played and played and played, and that was really what we were trying to do, to make the space so that it had a potential to respond in a very carefully designed way, but it was no pre-composed image, you see. There was no pre-recorded video, nothing was edited, right? It was all potential. It was not actual. But the potential was extremely carefully designed, artistically designed, and then people started to provide their activity, and the activity was enchanted in such a way. One of them was a dancer who, I don't remember her name. This was after the Bataclan attack, about a year after the attack in Paris. I was actually there that night, the year before. Anyway, so she had been doing her own performance art. She was doing once a day a 5-minute performance on the spot in different parts of Paris, and she decided to do that day's performance in the Rotunda. So I think that's it, basically, for tonight. Thank you very much for your attention.